The first professional football league in the United States was actually a soccer league. It's true. The American League of Professional Football was formed in 1894. Games were played according to the Association Rules of 1894, which refer to the laws agreed on by the International Football Association Board in late June of that year. And the whole thing was set up as an extra money-making venture by the owners of American baseball teams. Now, the real fascinating thing here is that this was not the first organization devoted to association football in the United States. That's right, the American Football Association was formed in 1884. It was an attempt to standardize football rules and procedures, which should sound familiar to you. That puts it only 21 years behind the formation of the Football Association in England, which it was associated with. The AFA was one of the oldest sports leagues in the world, though it seems that most of its responsibilities focused on cup matches. You see, most people in the United States who were interested in association football were congregated in the northeast part of the country. In fact, most of the early articles I could find about association football come from places like Fall River, Massachusetts, which was a stronghold for soccer not only in those days but up through the 1920s and 1930s. Anyway, for whatever reason, 6 baseball owners thought that a professional football league would be popular. The league formed with teams in Brooklyn, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. The idea was to play games from October through the end of June. The teams played their games in baseball stadiums, which must have made for a real interesting sight. That's what the whole idea was behind this scheme. Those old wooden baseball ballparks would sit vacant during the winter, and I guess the idea was to try to figure out a way to make money off of them during the off-season. Now, it's clear from the old articles that association football didn't have much of a hold on the American public at the time. The league received a bit of attention in newspapers far from the Northeast, such as this blurb in the Omaha Daily Bee in Nebraska. Of course, fans accustomed to the college form of football in those days must have been confused by scores like 3-2 and the concept of 45-minute halves. Even newspapers in cities like Baltimore required at least some sort of explanation of the game and its development. Now, I wish I could tell you dozens of stories about all the great legendary matches in those days, but unfortunately the league didn't last long enough for any of that. The first matches were held on October 6, 1894 in Boston and Philadelphia. By October 21, 1894, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle had reported that the league had disbanded. Now, there is some evidence that the team in Baltimore continued to play friendlies for a little while, but the football Baltimore Orioles also disbanded on November 21st. Now, that brings up the big question. I mean, what happened? Why did this fail? Well, one problem is that the professional league didn't have the backing of the AFA. In fact, anybody who played for the American League of Professional Football was barred from playing in AFA-sanctioned matches. That prevented star players from jumping. Another problem is the fact that the baseball season was still going. Opening day of the American League of Professional Football coincided with the Temple Cup championship game. The Temple Cup, by the way, was baseball's forerunner of the World Series. But the biggest problem in my mind is that the demand just wasn't there. You can see that in the old newspaper articles. The articles spend a lot of time talking about what the rules of the sport are, instead of about the drama taking place on the field. It was clearly a foreign game. Now, historians have also cited the fact that the National League faced a challenge from a possible rival organization. It's the National League in baseball, that is. So perhaps the owners were distracted. As a baseball historian, I can tell you that there indeed were attempts to form a rival baseball league in 1894. In fact, there were a string of attempts to do so from 1892 through 1901. But I'm not convinced that that had anything to do with the collapse of the Association Football League. And that brings me to the final and the most obvious question, which is why didn't they play American football? Well, we'll never have a satisfactory answer. However, I strongly suspect that the college football game was simply too violent. This was back in the days of smash-mouth football, the days of major injuries and running the ball up the gut on every down. The forward pass had not yet been invented and was clearly against the rules. A month after the collapse of the American League of Professional Football, Harvard and Yale met in one of the most legendary early American football matches of all time. This was called the Hampden Park Bloodbath. Nobody died in the bloodbath, but a few players came close, and I'm not exaggerating. Apparently, that's what the public wanted. Well, and there you have it. We can only guess at how different the American sporting landscape would have been if this league hadn't folded so soon. But unfortunately, association football, or soccer, remained a foreign sport in the United States for nearly a century. In fact, for the average American today, it still does feel kind of foreign.